She spent her entire life buried under thick wool sweaters and baggy jeans, terrified of a world that judged every soft curve and plump roll of her body. Stella thought she was invisible. She wanted to be invisible, but you can't hide from a predator whose senses are tuned to your exact heartbeat. When the most feared immortal in Boston finally backed her into a corner, he didn't demand her blood. He tore her oversized coat and growled, "Mine to worship." To live as a fat woman in a city like Boston was to exist in a constant state of apology. Stella Caroline knew this better than anyone. At 24, she had perfected the art of taking up as little space as possible, a stark paradox to the physical reality of her soft, plump body. Her daily uniform was meticulously curated, not for fashion but for concealment. Today it was a men's triple XL vintage Harvard hoodie that hung past her thighs, paired with wide-leg corduroy trousers that masked the heavy, dimpled curve of her thighs and calves. She wasn't just curvy, she was fat. She had a pronounced belly that she subconsciously covered with her forearms. Whenever she sat down, thick upper arms she despised, and a heavy, full chest that made standard blouses gape awkwardly. Society had made its disdain for her body clear through decades of unsolicited diet advice from aunts, the judgmental side eyes from girls in Lululemon leggings on the Green Line, and the overt rudeness of retail workers. So, Stella built a fortress of oversized cotton, fleece, and wool. Her sanctuary was Abernathy and Sons Antiquities, a dimly lit, dusty, rare bookstore nestled on a quiet end of Newbury Street. It was the kind of place that smelled of decaying paper binding glue and old leather, a place where history was revered and the superficial demands of the modern world faded away. Her boss, Arthur Abernathy, was a cantankerous man who cared only for the preservation of first editions, leaving Stella to work in peace in the back restoration room. It was a freezing Tuesday in November when the bell above the shop door chimed, cutting through the low hum of Stella's Spotify indie playlist. She was at the front counter, replacing a stack of protective mylar sleeves. She glanced up, expecting another lost tourist looking for a bathroom. Instead, the air in the shop seemed to instantly freeze, growing heavy and thick. He was without a doubt the most intimidating man Stella had ever seen in real life. He stood at least 6'4", his broad shoulders easily filling out a bespoke charcoal grey cashmere overcoat. His jawline looked sharp enough to cut glass, but it was his eyes that forced the breath from Stella's lungs. They were a striking, unnatural shade of amber, currently scanning the cluttered shop with an air of aristocratic disdain. Her beautiful, thin co-worker, Jessica, practically tripped over herself, rushing out from the front office. Jessica smoothed down her fitted pencil skirt, throwing on a brilliant, flirtatious smile. "Welcome to Abernathy's. How can I help you, sir?" The man didn't even look at Jessica. His amber eyes had locked onto Stella. Stella felt a sudden frantic fluttering in her chest. She instinctively crossed her arms over her oversized hoodie, hunching her shoulders to make herself smaller. "Don't look at me," she thought desperately. "Look at Jessica." "Everyone looks at Jessica." "I am looking for a specific text," the man said. His voice was a rich, dark baritone, smooth like aged whiskey, with a faint, untraceable European accent. "The Codex of St. Cyprian. I was informed it was recently acquired in an estate sale by Mr. Abernathy." Jessica blinked, her smile faltering at being so thoroughly ignored. "Oh, Stella is our archivist. She handles the new acquisitions." The man took slow, deliberate steps toward the counter where Stella stood frozen. With every step, a strange, static electricity seemed to crackle in the air. He stopped, just on the other side of the glass display case. Up close, his skin was flawlessly pale, and he smelled incredible, a hypnotic blend of cold night air bergamot and old cedar wood. "Stella," he said, testing her name on his tongue as if tasting it. The sound sent a hot shiver straight down her spine. "I am Nico Caldwell." I can check the logs," Stella stammered, hating how small and breathy her voice sounded. She turned her back to him, her face burning hot as she frantically clicked through the shop's outdated computer system. She could feel his gaze burning into her back. It wasn't the usual look of disgust or pity she received from conventionally attractive men. It was something heavier, darker, hungry, We do have it, Stella said, turning back around, clutching her tablet like a shield against her chest. But it's currently in the restoration vault. The binding was heavily damaged by water. It won't be ready for viewing or purchase until Friday. Nico tilted his head, his amber eyes dropping for a fraction of a second to the bulky folds of her hoodie before snapping back to her hazel eyes. He inhaled slowly, a subtle flaring of his nostrils. Friday. He repeated softly. That is unacceptable. I require it tonight. I'm sorry, Mr. Caldwell, but the adhesive... I will pay $50,000 for the text as it is. Tonight, Jessica gasped audibly in the background. Stella's mouth fell open. $50,000 for a waterlogged occult text from the 16th century was absurd. Abernathy had bought the entire lot for barely $3,000. I would have to call Mr. Abernathy, Stella said, her heart hammering against her ribs. Do so, Nico said. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a thick matte black card with nothing but an address and a phone number embossed in silver leaf. He slid it across the glass counter. His long, pale fingers brushed against her knuckles. Stella gasped, instantly yanking her hand back. His skin was freezing cold, ice cold. Nico didn't apologize. He simply stared at the pink flush rising in her plump cheeks. When you secure the book, Stella, you will deliver it to this address personally at 9 o'clock. We have couriers. Nico interrupted, his voice dropping an octave, carrying an undeniable command that made her knees feel weak. Only you. Wear something warm. The wind off the Charles River is biting tonight. Before she could form a coherent protest, he turned and swept out of the shop, the little bell chiming merrily in his wake. Stella stood trembling, staring at the black card, completely unaware that she had just drawn the obsession of Boston's oldest and most ruthless vampire king. Mr. Abernathy nearly suffered a coronary when Stella called him about the $50,000 offer. He demanded she pack the fragile codex immediately and deliver it, promising her a massive bonus if the sale went through. By 8:15 p.m. Stella was standing on the platform at the Arlington T station, clutching a heavy waterproof satchel to her chest. The weather had turned miserable, a classic New England freezing rain. To combat the cold, and to further hide herself, she wore her most obnoxiously large piece of clothing, a heavily padded black Michelin Man-style puffercoat that fell to her calves. Underneath, she wore a pair of baggy black sweatpants and a massive, thrifted men's flannel shirt. She felt like a walking, shapeless blob. Her mind raced as the train rattled toward Beacon Hill. Nico Caldwell. She had Googled him on her break. There wasn't much, just a few mentions of a holding company, real estate acquisitions, and vague rumors of him being a reclusive billionaire who owned the Crimson Velvet, an exclusive invite-only underground nightclub. There were no photos, no social media. At 8:55 p.m., Stella stood before a massive iron-wrought gate guarding an imposing ivy-covered brownstone in the most expensive sector of Beacon Hill. The cobblestone streets were slick and empty. She pressed the brass intercom button. "The gate is open, Stella." Nico's voice crackled through the speaker before she even announced herself. She pushed through the heavy gate and walked up the stone steps, the freezing rain violently lashing against her hood. Before she could even knock, the heavy mahogany door swung open. Nico stood in the foyer. He had shed his overcoat, now wearing a tailored black dress shirt with the top 2 buttons undone, and dark slacks that hugged his lean, muscular frame. The warm, amber glow of the house illuminated his unnervingly flawless face. "You're freezing," he observed. He didn't step aside immediately. Instead, he simply looked at her, standing on his threshold, dripping wet and completely swallowed by her enormous coat. "I have the book," Stella said, her teeth chattering slightly. She held up the satchel. "Come in," he murmured, stepping back. The foyer was breathtaking, high-vaulted ceilings, antique Persian rugs, and the quiet crackle of a massive fireplace in the adjoining parlor. The heavy oak door slammed shut behind her, sealing her inside. The sudden silence was deafening. The sound of the Boston traffic and the harsh rain vanished completely, as if the house was a soundproof vault. "Take off your coat," Nico said, stepping closer. Stella's grip tightened on the satchel. "I can just leave the book on the table, Mr. Caldwell. If you have the check." "Nico," and I said, "take off your coat. You are shivering. I will not have you catch pneumonia in my home." He didn't wait for her to comply. With a speed that made Stella blink in confusion, he was suddenly right in front of her. His hands, still freezing cold, brushed against her collar as he unzipped the massive puffer coat. panic flared in Stella's chest. "I can do it," she squeaked, stepping back. She awkwardly shimmied out of the wet coat. Without the massive puffer, she was left in her oversized red and black flannel and baggy sweatpants. It was an incredibly unflattering outfit, meant purely for comfort and hiding. She crossed her arms tightly over her heavy stomach, her shoulders hunched. Nico took the wet coat and hung it on a brass rack. When he turned back, his amber eyes slowly raked over her form. It wasn't the dismissive glance she was used to. It was agonizingly slow. He was looking at the way the flannel draped, tracing the hidden lines of her body with his eyes. "Why do you hide, Stella?" he asked softly, taking a slow step toward her. Her breath hitched. I'm not hiding. It's cold." "You wear layers meant for men twice your size." Nico noted his voice a low purr. He closed the distance between them, invading her personal space. The scent of bergamot and danger wrapped around her. "You fold your shoulders inward to diminish your width. You cross your arms to shield your stomach. You walk with a heavy, hurried step to avoid being perceived. Why?" Tears of hot humiliation pricked the corners of Stella's eyes. It was a massive violation of her carefully constructed boundaries. "That is none of your business," she whispered fiercely, looking down at her scuffed Converse sneakers. "Can we just do the transaction? I want to go home." Nico's hand reached out. His knuckles gently brushed the side of her soft, plump cheek. The touch sent a jolt of electricity straight to her core, making her gasp. "Your heart is beating at 130 beats per minute," Nico said, his gaze fixed on her neck, watching the frantic pulse of her carotid artery. "You smell of old paper, rain, and fear, but beneath the fear—" He leaned in closer, his lips hovering mere inches from her ear. "You smell sweet, like sugar and warm cream." Stella was paralyzed. Her mind was screaming at her to run, but her body was rooted to the spot, entirely captivated by the intense, predatory gravity of the man before her. He wasn't acting like a normal human being. The cold skin, the speed, the hearing of her heartbeat. "The book," she choked out, practically shoving the satchel into his chest to put a barrier between them. Nico caught the satchel with one hand, his eyes never leaving hers. "Very well, bring it into the study. Let us see what you have brought me." The study was a sprawling library that put Abernathy's shop to shame. Floor-to-ceiling mahogany bookshelves lined the walls, filled with ancient leather-bound tomes. Nico motioned for her to place the satchel on a massive claw-footed desk in the center of the room. Stella unbuckled the leather straps with trembling fingers and gently pulled out the Codex of St. Cyprian, enclosed in its protective mylar bag. "The binding is incredibly delicate," she warned, slipping into her professional archivist mode to ground her spiraling panic. "You shouldn't open it fully until the spine dries." Nico ignored the book entirely. He was leaning against the edge of the desk, arms crossed, simply watching her. "It's a spell book, isn't it?" Stella babbled nervously, desperate to fill the heavy silence. "Late 1500s, rumored to contain rituals for blood bindings and eternal life. Total folklore, obviously, but a beautiful piece of history." "Not folklore," Nico said flatly. Before Stella could process the terrifying sincerity in his tone, a horrific crashing sound echoed from the front of the house. The heavy mahogany front door splintered inward, groaning in protest. Stella jumped, letting out a shriek. Nico didn't flinch, but his amber eyes flashed to a terrifying, glowing crimson red. His polite, aristocratic demeanor vanished instantly, replaced by sheer primal violence. "Stay behind me," Nico snarled, his voice vibrating with a terrifying, inhuman resonance. Footsteps thudded heavily down the hall. A man stepped into the study doorway. He was completely soaked from the rain, wearing a leather jacket. His face was pale, but his eyes were black, pitch black, with dark veins spiderwebbing beneath the skin under his eyes. "Caldwell," the intruder sneered, his gaze flicking to the desk. "Word on the street was you finally tracked down the Codex. The Syndicate wants it." "Liam," Nico said coldly, "you have tracked mud onto my Persian rugs, and you have interrupted a private transaction." "I don't care about your rugs, you ancient relic," Liam laughed, exposing a set of elongated razor-sharp fangs. Stella felt all the blood drain from her face. Fangs, red eyes, black eyes. The sudden, impossible realization slammed into her with the force of a freight train. "Vampires! They are vampires!" Liam's black eyes suddenly snapped to Stella. A cruel, vicious grin spread across his face. "Oh, a snack, and a hearty one too. Lots of sweet fat to sink my teeth into. The insult stung a familiar, humiliating jab, even in the face of death. But before Stella could react, Liam lunged at her with blinding speed. He bypassed Nico entirely, aiming straight for Stella. She screamed as Liam's cold hands clamped onto her shoulders, yanking her forward. The sheer force of his grip ripped the thick, oversized flannel shirt right open the buttons, popping and scattering across the hardwood floor. The thin white tank top she wore underneath caught on his sharp claws, tearing violently down the middle. Suddenly, her soft, plump stomach, the deep, heavy curve of her waist, and the full swell of her chest, clad only in a cotton bra, were exposed to the cold air of the room. The horror of her exposed body was second only to the horror of Liam's fangs inching toward her neck. But Liam never made it. Nico moved faster than light. A low, guttural roar that shook the very foundations of the house erupted from his chest. He grabbed Liam by the back of the neck and the belt of his jeans, lifting the grown man over his head as if he weighed nothing more than a rag doll. With a sickening wet crack, Nico drove Liam spine first down over his knee, snapping his back completely in half. Liam dropped to the floor dead before he even fully hit the antique rug. Silence crashed back into the room, broken only by Stella's ragged, hyperventilating sobs. She stumbled back against the desk, her hands frantically crossing over her exposed stomach and chest, pulling the shredded edges of her flannel together in a desperate, deeply ingrained instinct of shame. No, 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 her mind chanted. He sees me. He sees how fat I am. He sees all the rolls, the softness, the disgusting truth. Nico stood over the dead body of his rival chest, heaving blood dripping from his claws. Slowly the crimson faded from his eyes, returning to that striking amber. He turned to look at Stella. She squeezed her eyes shut, turning her head away, waiting for the disgust, waiting for him to look away in revulsion. Instead, she heard the soft thud of knees hitting the hardwood floor. Stella opened her eyes in shock. Nico Caldwell, the terrifying, immortal vampire king who had just snapped a man in half without breaking a sweat, was kneeling on the floor at her feet. He didn't look at her face. His amber eyes were utterly fixated on the soft, plush expanse of her exposed stomach where her hands couldn't cover. There was no disgust in his gaze. There was no mockery. There was only raw, unadulterated hunger and a profound, trembling reverence. Slowly, carefully, he reached his cold hands up, gently wrapping his long fingers around her wrists. He pulled her hands away from her body, dismantling her shield. "Please," Stella sobbed, a fresh wave of humiliation washing over her. "Please don't look. I know it's ugly." Nico's jaw tightened. "Ugly?" He rasped, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't comprehend. "Who taught you such a vile lie?" He leaned forward, his face inches from her soft, exposed belly. The cold air radiating from him contrasted wildly with the hot flush of her skin. "For centuries, I have walked among humans who starve themselves to look like corpses," Nico whispered, his breath ghosting over her plump flesh, making her shiver violently. "Angular, hard, fragile things. But you..." He pressed a soft, impossibly gentle kiss to the side of her hip, right on a soft, dimpled curve she had spent her whole life hating. Stella gasped, her fingers digging into the edge of the mahogany desk to keep from collapsing. "You are soft," Nico murmured, tracing a path of kisses up the side of her waist. "You are abundant. You are a feast of warmth and life." He looked up at her, his amber eyes burning with a possessive fire that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. He didn't care about the dead body bleeding out on his rug. He didn't care about the $50,000 book on the desk. He only cared about her. "Mine," Nico growled, resting his cheek against the soft curve of her belly, as if resting his head on a sacred altar. "Mine to worship." Stella was trembling so hard she could barely stand, but then a sharp sting on her collarbone broke the spell. During the scuffle, Liam's claws must have grazed her. A single thick drop of blood swelled from a small cut on her shoulder and fell, landing squarely on the protective mylar of the Codex of St. Cyprian. As her blood touched the plastic, the ancient book beneath it began to hiss. A brilliant ethereal blue light pulsed from the water-damaged pages, illuminating the dark study. Nico's head snapped up, his eyes widening as he looked from the glowing book to the blood on Stella's shoulder. "Your blood," he breathed, standing up slowly. The reverence in his eyes shifted into absolute awe. "It isn't just your body that is a treasure, Stella Caroline. Do you have any idea who your ancestors are?" The blue light radiating from the codex of St. Cyprian cast harsh, ethereal shadows across the mahogany shelves. The air in the study immediately changed thick with the sharp, metallic tang of ozone and the heavy copper stench of the dead vampire bleeding out on the Persian rug. Stella couldn't breathe. Her chest heaved, pulling the torn edges of her cheap flannel shirt apart. She stared at the single drop of her blood which had somehow bypassed the protective mylar and sunk directly into the cracked, water-damaged leather of the ancient tome. The hissing sound faded, replaced by a low, rhythmic thrumming that vibrated in the floorboards. Nico stood up, his amber eyes wide with a shock that stripped away centuries of practiced aristocratic indifference. He stepped over Liam's broken corpse without a downward glance, closing the distance between himself and the desk. "The cipher," Nico murmured, his voice barely a rasp. He didn't touch the glowing book. Instead, he reached out and gently gripped Stella's chin with his freezing fingers, forcing her to look up from her exposed stomach and into his eyes. "Do you know who your ancestors are, Stella?" I don't," she stammered, her teeth chattering from a mixture of shock, the freezing draft from the broken front door, and the icy temperature of his skin. "My mum was adopted. We don't have a family tree. It's just normal blood." "There is nothing normal about a bloodline that can bypass a dormant ward," Nico said. He released her chin, his gaze dropping to the faint scratch on her collarbone, where Liam's claw had grazed her. In 1612, a woman named Alice Nutter was hanged at Lancaster Castle. The mortal records claim she was a wealthy widow caught up in the hysteria of the Pendle witch trials. The truth, known only to the syndicate, was that Alice was the keeper of the St. Cyprian bloodlocks. She was the only human capable of reading the untranslated pages of this text. When she died, the book went dormant, useless. Stella shook her head, a hysterical, breathless laugh escaping her throat. "You're insane. This is insane. There's a dead guy on your floor. You broke him in half, and now you're talking about witches from the 1600s. I am talking about why you are suddenly the most valuable creature in Boston," Nico corrected, his tone turning deadly serious. He moved suddenly, stripping off his tailored black dress shirt. The movement was so fluid and fast, Stella barely tracked it. He stood bare-chested for a fraction of a second, a terrifying display of pale, marble-hard muscle, completely devoid of body hair or scars, before he draped the heavy, still warm silk blend shirt over Stella's trembling shoulders. It dwarfed her, the sleeves hanging past her fingertips, but it smelled intoxicatingly of bergamot and him. Instinctively, she pulled the lapels tight across her heavy breasts and plump stomach, gripping the fabric like a lifeline. "You're hiding again," he noted softly, a frown creasing his flawless brow. "Because I am fat and my clothes are ripped." Stella finally snapped, the terrifying absurdity of the situation breaking her polite, apologetic exterior. Tears of profound frustration spilled over her eyelashes, cutting hot tracks down her cheeks. "A monster just tried to eat me. You murdered him. My shirt is ruined, and I weigh 220 pounds. I don't want to be looked at." The silence in the room stretched heavy and suffocating. The thrumming of the book seemed to match her frantic heartbeat. Nico didn't laugh. He didn't offer a patronizing platitude. He stepped into her personal space, completely uncaring of the blood on his slacks, and placed his large, cold hands firmly on her waist. His thumbs pressed into the soft, deep indentations of her sides. "Your weight is a numerical value invented by a society obsessed with starvation," Nico said, his voice a low, vibrating rumble in his chest. "I am 450 years old, Stella. I have seen the Renaissance. I have seen the marble statues carved in the likeness of goddesses, women with soft bellies, heavy thighs and full breasts, women who looked exactly like you. You are not a flaw. You are the original standard of worship." Stella's breath hitched, her heart hammered against her ribs, entirely confused. Every instinct she had developed since middle school told her to suck in her stomach, to pull away, to apologize for taking up space in his hands. But his grip was firm, anchoring her to the floor. "Liam saw you as prey," Nico continued, his amber eyes darkening to the color of burnt sugar. "But I see you as a masterpiece, and right now you are a masterpiece in extreme danger." He let go of her waist, stepping back. The sudden absence of his touch left her feeling strangely hollow despite his freezing temperature. "The Syndicate knows the book is here," Nico said, his tone shifting back to the cold, calculating immortal. "Liam was a scout, a bottom feeder. When he does not report back, Alistair Reed will send his elite guard, and they will have smelled your blood on Liam's claws before he entered this room." "Alistair Reed," Stella whispered, pulling the oversized shirt tighter around her neck. "The head of the New England Syndicate. He has spent a century looking for a descendant of the Nutter bloodline to unlock the Codex. He wants the daylight walking rituals inside it." Nico turned his back to her, looking at the broken front door. The rain was blowing into the foyer, pooling on the expensive rugs. "You cannot go back to your apartment. You cannot go back to Abernathy's. If you leave this house, you will be dead before sunrise." Panic, cold and sharp, pierced her stomach. "I have a cat. I have rent. I will have my people collect your animal and your belongings," Nico said without looking back. He bent down, grabbing Liam's corpse by the collar of his leather jacket with one hand. The sheer casual strength of it made Stella nauseous. "Go up the main staircase. First door on the right. Lock it. Do not come out until I come for you. I must dispose of this trash and secure the perimeter." Stella didn't argue. She clutched his shirt to her chest, grabbed her waterproof satchel, and practically ran out of the study. The master suite on the second floor was massive, suffocatingly dark and undeniably masculine. Heavy emerald velvet drapes blacked out the tall windows, plunging the room into absolute darkness, save for the ambient light bleeding in from the hallway. The bed was a colossal, four-poster antique draped in heavy furs and black silk sheets. Stella locked the heavy oak door behind her and collapsed against it, sliding down until her plush backside hit the hardwood floor. She pulled her knees to her chest, burying her face in the expensive fabric of Nico's shirt. She stayed there for what felt like hours, listening to the muffled sounds downstairs, the scraping of heavy furniture, the grinding of stone, the subtle, unnatural silence that followed. Eventually, her bladder forced her to move. She crawled up from the floor, her joints aching from the adrenaline crash, and found the adjoining master bathroom. It was a cavernous space made entirely of black marble and brushed brass. She flipped on the vanity light and physically flinched at her reflection. Her curly brown hair was a frizzy, rain-soaked disaster. Her makeup was smeared under her hazel eyes, and beneath the open lapels of Nico's oversized shirt, the torn remnants of her white tank top barely covered her. Her heavy stomach pushed out the dimpled flesh resting over the waistband of her baggy sweatpants. Her thick, pale thighs rubbed together as she shifted her weight. She hated it. She hated all of it. She turned the hot water on in the massive glass shower, stripping off the ruined, soaked clothes. She didn't look down as she washed the freezing rain and the scent of ozone from her skin using a bar of soap that smelled sharply of cedarwood. When she stepped out, she found a massive, charcoal-gray cashmere robe folded on the vanity counter. It hadn't been there when she walked in. He had been in the room. He moved so silently it was terrifying. She wrapped the robe around herself, tying the sash tightly. It enveloped her completely, the hem dragging on the floor, the soft wool, a stark contrast to her usual abrasive cotton hoodies. When she finally opened the bathroom door and stepped back into the bedroom, the heavy velvet drapes were still drawn tight, but the bedside lamps were on, casting a warm golden glow. Nico was sitting in a high-backed leather armchair in the corner. He had changed into a clean black t-shirt and dark jeans. He looked impossibly relaxed, completely unbothered by the fact that he had just committed a brutal murder downstairs. On the small table beside him sat a heavy silver tray. The smell hit Stella's nose instantly, making her stomach give a loud, embarrassing rumble. "Come sit," Nico said, his voice a smooth, deep octave that vibrated in the quiet room. Stella hesitated, clutching the collar of the cashmere robe. She walked slowly, her bare feet sinking into the thick wool rug. When she reached the table, her eyes widened. It wasn't a delicate salad or a polite, restrictive portion. It was a massive cut of prime rib cooked rare resting in a pool of rich, dark demi-glace. Beside it was a mound of buttery, roasted garlic, mashed potatoes, and thick-cut asparagus glistening with oil. "I don't," Stella started, her cheeks burning hot. "I don't eat like this late at night. Your heart rate has stabilized, but your blood sugar has crashed," Nico observed, his amber eyes watching her intently. "You experienced extreme physical trauma and adrenaline depletion. You need iron, You need fat. Sit down and eat." He didn't make it a request. Stella sank onto the edge of the massive bed, pulling the tray onto her lap. She picked up the heavy silver fork. Eating in front of conventionally attractive men had always been a source of profound anxiety for her. She was hyper-aware of how her jaw moved, terrified of looking gluttonous, terrified of confirming their internal biases about her body. But the smell of the food overpowered her anxiety. She took a bite of the prime rib, and a soft groan of pleasure escaped her lips before she could stop it. Nico shifted in his chair, his eyes darkening instantly. The subtle sound of his intake of breath filled the room. Stella froze her cheeks, flooding with color. "Sorry. Never apologize for finding pleasure," Nico said softly. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "The human world conditions you to starve, to deprive yourselves. Vampires understand that deprivation only leads to madness. We consume what we desire. You should do the same." She took another bite of the potatoes, forcing herself to chew slowly under his intense, unwavering stare. "What did you do with Liam?" "He is ash in the Charles River," Nico replied casually. "And the front door is barricaded with a steel plate. The perimeter wards are active. Alistair will not breach this house easily." "How long do I have to stay here?" "Until I decide it is safe." Nico's gaze dropped from her face to the V-neck opening of the cashmere robe where the soft, pale swell of her cleavage was visible. "Which may be a very long time, Stella." Stella put the fork down, suddenly losing her appetite as a different kind of hunger filled the room. "You can't just keep me locked up. I have a job." "Abernathy will be compensated for your sudden resignation," Nico said smoothly. He stood up, towering over her sitting form. He took the heavy silver tray from her lap and placed it back on the table. Then he knelt before her, just as he had in the study. Stella's breath caught in her throat. She instinctively tried to pull her thick legs up onto the bed to hide her body, but Nico reached out and placed his cold hands flat against her bare knees. "Stop," he commanded, though the word was spoken like a prayer. His thumbs slowly traced the soft, dimpled flesh of her lower thighs, right where the cashmere robe parted. "Stop retreating from me. I don't understand," Stella whispered, a tear slipping free. "You're a billionaire. You're a king. You could have any supermodel, any beautiful thin woman in the world. Why are you looking at me like this?" Nico's hands slid higher up her thighs, sliding under the heavy wool of the robe. The contrast of his freezing skin against her hot flesh sent a violent shiver straight to her core. "Because thin women feel like corpses," Nico growled, his amber eyes flashing with a possessive, territorial heat. He pressed his face against her knee, inhaling deeply. "They are rigid, bony, hard. When I touch them, I am reminded of the grave. But you—" His cold hands squeezed the heavy, plush flesh of her thighs, kneading the softness with a reverence that made Stella's vision swim. "You are yielding," he whispered, his voice thick with raw need. "You are warm. You are absolute, abundant life. Every curve, every roll, every soft inch of you is a testament to vitality. I do not want bone, Stella. I want flesh. I want to sink into you and forget the cold." He looked up at her, his flawless face intensely serious. "You are not a captive here. You are the queen of this house, and tomorrow we will figure out what the Codex wants with your blood. But tonight you will sleep, and you will not hide from me ever again." Morning arrived without a single ray of sunlight. The master suite remained entombed behind the heavy emerald velvet curtains, smelling faintly of bergamot and the sharp, metallic tang of cold rain. Stella woke up tangled in black silk sheets, her body aching with the stiff, heavy exhaustion that follows a massive adrenaline crash. She rolled over her hand, brushing against something warm and vibrating. A startled gasp caught in her throat before she opened her eyes. Curled into a fat orange ball on the adjacent pillow was Barnaby, her 12-pound rescue tabby. He chirped a sleepy greeting and shoved his head against her palm. Nico had actually sent someone to her terrible basement apartment in Somerville to retrieve her cat. A polite, rhythmic knock sounded at the heavy oak door. Stella pulled the thick cashmere robe tight across her chest, burying her soft stomach beneath the folds. Yes, the door clicked open. A tall, impeccably dressed woman with pale skin and sharp, severe features stepped into the room. She carried a garment bag over one arm and a steaming mug in her free hand. Her eyes, a flat, icy blue, scanned the room before settling on Stella. "Good evening, Miss Caroline. I am Clara," she said, her voice devoid of inflection. "Mr. Caldwell requested I bring you coffee. Black, 2 sugars, exactly as you prefer. I have also procured your wardrobe." Stella took the mug with trembling fingers. The heat radiating through the ceramic grounded her slightly. "Evening, what time is it?" "It is currently 8 o'clock at night. You slept through the day." Clara unzipped the garment bag and draped its contents over the velvet armchair. "Mr. Caldwell took your measurements while you rested. I had a tailor construct these pieces this afternoon. Your previous garments were insufficient for your frame?" Stella flushed, her defensive instincts flaring. She stared at the clothing. There were no oversized hoodies, no men's flannel shirts, no shapeless sweatpants. Instead, Clara had laid out a thick, heavy-knit wrap dress in a deep, bruising shade of burgundy. Beside it sat seamless undergarments and a pair of soft leather flats. "I don't wear dresses," Stella said tightly. "They don't fit right. They ride up." "This garment was cut explicitly for a woman of your substance," Clara replied flatly without a hint of judgment. "It will not ride up. Mr. Caldwell is waiting for you in the parlor when you are ready." Clara bowed her head slightly and exited the room, closing the door softly behind her. Stella stared at the burgundy dress for a long time. The fabric was dense and heavy, designed to drape rather than cling. She set the coffee down, stripped off the robe, and put on the new undergarments. They fit perfectly, supporting the heavy swell of her breasts and smoothing the deep dip of her waist without compressing her. She pulled the dress over her head and tied the thick sash at her side. She walked to the full-length antique mirror and stopped dead. She looked massive. She looked undeniable. The deep V-neck exposed the pale, freckled skin of her chest, and the heavy knit fabric hugged the wide, dimpled curve of her hips and the thick expanse of her thighs. It didn't hide her stomach. The sash sat right above her belly, framing its softness. For 24 years, she had tried to look smaller. This dress did the exact opposite. It demanded space. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she opened the bedroom door and walked down the main staircase. The brownstone was entirely locked down. Thick steel plates had been dropped over the ground floor windows, and the shattered front door had been replaced entirely. She found Nico in the parlor. He stood by the massive fireplace, flanked by a broad-shouldered man with a shaved head and a vicious scar running down his jaw. Nico stopped mid-sentence as Stella entered. His amber eyes locked onto her, tracking the slow, heavy sway of her hips in the burgundy knit. The air in the room instantly grew colder, charged with a heavy, static tension. "Harrison, leave us!" Nico ordered, his voice dropping to a gravelly purr. The scarred man glanced at Stella, bowed his head respectfully, and walked out. Nico crossed the room. He didn't stop until his chest was inches from hers. He reached out, sliding his large, freezing hands past her waist to grip the thick, heavy curve of her hips. His long fingers dug into the soft flesh beneath the burgundy fabric. "You look exactly as you were meant to," Nico murmured, his gaze dropping to the deep plunge of the neckline. "A vessel of absolute abundance. No more cotton armor, Stella. Never again." "It's tight," she whispered nervously, her hands fluttering up to rest against his cold chest. "Everyone will see. There is no one here to see you but me," Nico corrected, his thumb tracing the soft dip of her hip bone. "And my men know better than to look too closely at their queen. Come to the study. We have a war to plan, and your blood is the map." The temperature in the library was freezing, kept intentionally cold to preserve the ancient text. In the center of the room, resting on a heavy marble pedestal, was the Codex of St. Cyprian. Stella gasped as she approached it. The water damage was entirely gone. The cracked, peeling leather had smoothed out into a dark, pristine hide, and the pages no longer smelled of mildew. They smelled faintly of ozone and copper. "Your blood rebuilt the binding," Nico said, standing right behind her. The cold radiating from his body seeped through the heavy knit of her dress, making her shiver. "But the pages remain blank. The cipher requires a willing tether to reveal its ink." "Harrison mentioned a war," Stella said, wrapping her arms securely around her plump stomach. "Alistair Reed. He wants this book." "Alistair commands 300 vampires across the New England seaboard," Nico explained, his voice entirely devoid of fear, stating it purely as a tactical fact. "They are trapped by the sun, just as I am. For a century, Alistair has hunted for a descendant of Alice Nutter. He believes the Codex contains a daylight walking spell, a simple incantation. It doesn't Magic of this magnitude is never simple, Nico said. He stepped around her, placing his hands flat on the marble pedestal. It is not a spell, it is a blood bond. The vampire who wishes to walk in the sun must bind their soul to the descendant of the witch who wrote the codex. The human becomes an anchor. As long as the human lives and stands in the sunlight, the vampire may do the same. If Alistair captures you, he will not bind with you. He will drain you entirely, boiling your blood down to synthesize a temporary sun serum for his army. You will be nothing but a harvested resource. Stella felt a cold sweat break out on the back of her thick neck. And you? Why did you want the book? Nico turned his head, his amber eyes locking onto hers. I wanted it to keep it out of his hands. I have ruled Boston from the shadows for 200 years. I do not need the sun. He stepped away from the pedestal, closing the distance between them until she was backed against the edge of a mahogany desk. But then I met the descendant. He reached out his cold hands, gently gripping her thick upper arms. He ran his palms down to her elbows, feeling the soft, yielding weight of her flesh. If I bind with you, Stella, the daylight ward is permanent, but it comes with a cost. My immortality becomes tied to your life force. If you die, I burn to ash. He leaned down, his face inches from hers. You would cease to be a mortal archivist. You would become an immortal queen tied directly to my soul. Neither of us would age. Neither of us would rot. Stella's breath came in short, heavy gasps. Why me? She demanded, a sudden fierce anger piercing through her fear. Because my great-great-grandmother was a witch in 1612. Because I'm a convenient tool. Do not insult me. Nico growled, his eyes flashing crimson for a fraction of a second. He gripped her thick thighs, lifting her effortlessly by her hips and sitting her firmly onto the edge of the mahogany desk. The sudden elevation put her face level with his. He stepped between her parted knees, burying his cold face into the soft plush valley of her breasts, exposed by the wrap dress. He inhaled deeply, a ragged, shuddering breath that vibrated against her skin. I have wealth that outlives nations, Nico murmured against her skin, the cold press of his lips sending violent electric shocks straight to her core. I have power that makes men weep. I do not need a tool. I need you. I want the heavy weight of your thighs against my hips. I want the soft, yielding depth of your stomach pressed to mine. I want to spend the next 5 centuries burying myself in the warmth of your flesh. Your bloodline is an accident of history. My worship of your body is a choice. He pulled back slightly, his amber eyes burning with a raw, terrifying honesty. Bind with me, Stella. Let me drink from you willingly. Let me anchor my soul to your heavy, perfect heart. And I swear to you, no creature on this earth will ever make you feel small again. Tears spilled hotly over her cheeks, landing on his cold knuckles. For the first time in her life, the overwhelming desire to hide simply vanished. He saw every inch of her fat, dimpled, heavy body, and he looked at her like she was the Holy Grail. Okay, Stella whispered. Her voice trembled, but her hands were steady as she reached up, burying her fingers into his dark hair. Do it. Nico let out a low, guttural groan. He didn't hesitate. He tilted her head to the side, exposing the thick, soft column of her pale neck. He didn't bite immediately. He dragged his cold, open mouth over her pulse point, tasting the salt of her sweat. Then she felt the sharp, agonizing slide of 2 elongated fangs piercing her flesh. Stella screamed, her back arching, her soft stomach pressing flush against his rock-hard torso. The pain was blindingly sharp for exactly 2 seconds before a rush of overwhelming narcotic euphoria flooded her veins. It felt like sinking into a hot bath on a freezing day, her heavy arms wrapped tightly around his broad shoulders, pulling him deeper into her neck. Nico drank deeply, his large hands gripping her thick waist, anchoring her to him as he drew her blood into his dead veins. On the marble pedestal behind them, the Codex of St. Cyprian reacted violently. The pages snapped open, flipping rapidly, as if caught in a windstorm. Where there was once blank parchment, a brilliant glowing blue ink began to bleed across the paper, filling the margins with jagged, frantic Latin runes. Nico pulled back, his mouth smeared with her dark crimson blood. His amber eyes were blown wide, pupils dilated to thin black slits. He pressed his bleeding wrist to her torn neck, forcing his own freezing immortal blood into her wound. The moment his blood entered her system, a shockwave of agonizing heat exploded in Stella's chest. It felt like swallowing a live coal. She gasped, her vision white-lining as the ancient magic stitched their life forces together in a brutal, permanent knot. Before she could catch her breath, a deafening metallic shriek echoed through the brownstone. The heavy floorboards beneath the mahogany desk violently trembled. The sound of screeching iron and shattering stone reverberated through the walls. Harrison burst through the library doors, a massive custom-built shotgun gripped in his hands. His face was covered in dark soot. "The perimeter wards are failing," Harrison barked, slamming a shell into the chamber. Alistair didn't send scouts this time. He brought the vanguard. "They're breaching the steel plates." Nico wiped Stella's blood from his jaw with his thumb. He turned slowly toward the library doors, the affectionate, worshipping lover vanishing instantly. In his place stood the apex predator of Boston, his fangs fully descended, his eyes burning a solid, terrifying red. "Keep her behind the desk," Nico ordered, his voice echoing with an inhuman, monstrous double timbre. "If any of them get within 10 feet of her, burn the entire room down." Splintered oak rained across the antique Persian rugs as the library doors were ripped completely off their iron hinges. Dust choked the freezing air, mingling instantly with the sharp, acidic stench of cordite. Harrison didn't hesitate. He planted his heavy boots, aimed his custom-built shotgun at the gaping doorway, and squeezed the trigger. The concussive boom was a physical pressure that punched Stella in the chest. She clamped her hands over her ringing ears, sliding down until her soft, heavy thighs hit the floor behind the mahogany desk. Above her, the blue light from the Codex of St. Cyprian pulsed in frantic, irregular flashes, matching the chaotic rhythm of her violently racing heart. The foreign blood Nico had forced into her veins felt like a ribbon of liquid fire wrapping around her spine. 3 figures rushed through the dust cloud. The lead vampire, a tall, gaunt man in a tactical vest, took Harrison's shotgun blast directly to the chest. The impact blew a hole the size of a dinner plate through his torso, spraying dark, slick blood across the bookshelves, but the creature didn't even stumble. He lunged, his elongated claws tearing into Harrison's shoulder. Nico moved. He didn't use a weapon. He was the weapon. With a guttural roar that vibrated in the floorboards, Nico collided with the gaunt vampire, driving him headfirst into a solid marble pillar. The wet, sickening crunch of the skull caving in echoed over the gunfire. Nico didn't pause to watch the body drop. He spun, grabbing the second intruder by the throat and tearing his head from his shoulders in one fluid, brutally efficient motion. Then a slow, mocking clap echoed from the ruined doorway. Alistair Reed stepped over the threshold. He looked entirely out of place in a war zone. He wore a pristine navy blue bespoke suit, his silver hair perfectly coiffed. His eyes were not red, but a terrifying milky white, a side effect of centuries spent consuming the blood of lesser vampires. Beside him stood a massive, brutish enforcer, Declan Murphy, a known syndicate butcher who had terrorized the South Boston docks for decades. "You always were overly dramatic, Nico." Alistair sneered, his gaze sweeping the ruined library. The milky white eyes finally landed on the glowing book on the pedestal and then shifted to the mahogany desk where Stella was hiding. He inhaled deeply, his nostrils flaring. "And you have been keeping secrets. I can smell her from here. A mortal reeking of old magic and sweet, abundant fat. The Nutter bloodline. "She is mine, Alistair," Nico growled. He stepped between Alistair and the desk, his broad chest heaving, his fangs fully descended. Blood dripped from his chin onto his black t-shirt. "You are trespassing in my home. Your home is currently surrounded by 40 of my vanguard," Alistair said smoothly, pulling a silver-handled cane from his side. "Harrison is bleeding out on your rug. You have perhaps 3 minutes before my men tear down the steel plates over the windows and let the dawn into this room. Surrender the girl Caldwell. I will bleed her dry, synthesize the daylight serum, and perhaps I will let you live in the dark." I do not live in the dark anymore, Nico stated, his voice dropping to a terrifying, absolute calm. Declan Murphy lunged. He was massive, built like a freight train, but Nico met him halfway. The two immortals clashed with the force of a car wreck. The impact sent a shockwave through the room, shattering the glass faces of the antique grandfather clocks. Stella peered over the edge of the desk, her breath caught in her throat. Declan drove a silver blade into Nico's side. Nico didn't even flinch. He gripped Declan's wrist, snapping the bone with a sharp twist before burying his own claws deep into Declan's ribcage. Alistair didn't join the fight. He used the distraction to blur across the room, bypassing Nico entirely. Stella barely registered the movement before Alistair was standing over her. His milky white eyes widened in twisted fascination as he looked down at her. "Look at the sheer size of you," Alistair murmured, a cruel smile stretching across his face. He reached down, his freezing fingers grabbing a fistful of her thick curly hair, hauling her up from the floor. Stella cried out, her heavy body dragging against the edge of the mahogany desk. The heavy knit of her burgundy wrap dress snagged on a splinter of wood, pulling the V-neck wide open, exposing the deep swell of her breasts and the soft plush curve of her collarbone. "So much blood," Alistair whispered, leaning in to sniff the torn skin on her neck where Nico had bitten her. "So much sweet, insulated flesh to harvest. It is a tragedy I have to boil you down to ash." "Get away from me," Stella screamed. She didn't cower. The liquid fire Nico had injected into her veins flared violently. Without thinking, Stella slammed the heel of her hand directly into Alistair's nose. To a vampire, a human strike should have felt like a gentle breeze, but Stella was no longer just human. She was the anchor. As her hand made contact, the blue runes from the codex flashed blindingly bright. A shockwave of pure kinetic magic erupted from her palm. Alistair was thrown backward, as if struck by a cannonball. He smashed through a towering bookshelf buried under hundreds of heavy leather-bound tomes. Nico, having just ripped Declan's heart from his chest, spun around at the sound of the blast. He saw Stella standing beside the desk, her chest heaving, her hazel eyes wide with shock at her own power. The blue runes from the book were now glowing faintly beneath the skin of her arms and her soft stomach. "The ward," Nico breathed, his amber eyes flaring with absolute awe. But the victory was cut short. A deafening metallic screech echoed from the eastern wall of the library. Alistair's vanguard had attached chains to the steel window plates, using heavy-duty tow trucks on the street below to rip the barricades away. With a horrific groan of bending iron, the entire wall of shutters was torn loose. The freezing pre-dawn wind howled into the library, scattering ancient pages and dust into a blinding cyclone. The darkness of the room was instantly compromised by the creeping grey light of the morning. It was 5:42 a.m. Sunrise was exactly 3 minutes away. Alistair dug himself out from beneath the rubble of the bookshelf. His nose was broken, leaking black blood over his pristine suit. The sophisticated aristocrat was gone, replaced by a desperate, snarling beast. "Tear the roof down!" Alistair screamed to his men waiting outside the shattered windows. "Let the sun in, burn him!" Nico didn't retreat into the shadows of the hallway. He stalked forward, stepping directly into the grey light filtering through the broken wall. He grabbed Alistair by the lapels of his suit, lifting him off his feet. "You wanted the sun, Alistair!" Nico roared, throwing the syndicate leader violently toward the massive, gaping hole in the wall. "Have it!" Alistair scrambled backward, his boots slipping on the slick, blood-soaked rugs. He looked out over the Charles River. The horizon was bleeding from bruised purple to a brilliant burning orange. The first direct ray of sunlight crested the Boston skyline, piercing straight into the library. It hit Alistair's leg first. The reaction was instantaneous and horrific. Alistair's flesh hissed, bubbling and cracking like meat tossed into a deep fryer. He let out an ear-piercing shriek, dragging his burning leg into the shadows of a fallen pillar. "Kill him!" Alistair screamed to the vanguard outside, his voice breaking in agony. But the vanguard was completely silent. They had dropped their chains and fled down Charles Street, scurrying into the sewers and storm drains like rats the moment the sun broke the horizon. They were loyal to power, not to a burning man. The shaft of sunlight slowly expanded across the ruined library floor, inching toward the mahogany desk. Stella stood frozen. She watched the golden light hit the toe of Nico's boot. She braced herself for the hiss of burning flesh, for the agonizing scream. The light climbed his dark jeans. It illuminated the blood soaked into his black t-shirt. It struck his pale, flawless face, turning his amber eyes into pools of molten gold. Nothing happened. Nico Caldwell, a creature who had not felt the warmth of the sun in 450 years, stood completely unharmed in the morning light. He closed his eyes, tilting his head back, inhaling the crisp, sun-baked air. His chest expanded, a look of profound, overwhelming peace washing over his sharp features. The blood bond was absolute. The daylight ward had held. He opened his eyes and turned to look at Stella. She was standing in the shadows, the blue runes slowly fading under her skin. Her burgundy dress was torn, her thick hair was a wild mess, and she was trembling from the sheer drop in adrenaline. To anyone else, she looked like a disaster. To Nico, she was a goddess who had just handed him the sky. He walked over to Alistair, who was cowering in the diminishing shadows. Without a word, Nico grabbed the syndicate leader by the throat and dragged him directly into the center of the sunbeam. Alistair's screams echoed off the mahogany walls as his body rapidly oxidized, turning from flesh to charcoal, and finally collapsing into a pile of fine grey ash that blew away in the morning wind. The war was over. Nico didn't look at the ash. He walked straight to Stella. The air around him was no longer freezing cold. His skin was radiating a deep human warmth, heated by the sun he had absorbed. He fell to his knees in front of her, ignoring the broken glass and splintered wood on the floor. "Nico!" Stella whispered, her voice cracking. He didn't speak. He wrapped his strong, warm arms around her wide hips, burying his face directly into her soft, plump stomach. He inhaled the scent of her skin, sugar sweat, and ozone. His hands gripped the heavy flesh of her thighs, kneading the softness with a desperate, worshipping reverence. "You gave me the sun," Nico murmured, his voice muffled against her thick waist. "You gave me the world." Stella slowly reached down, her trembling fingers tangling in his dark, thick hair. The deeply ingrained instinct to pull away, to apologize for her size, to hide her body, was entirely gone. When he touched her, she didn't feel fat. She felt vast. She felt powerful. Nico stood up, his hands sliding up her ribcage to cup her heavy breasts through the torn knit fabric, his thumbs gently resting against her rapid pulse. He looked deeply into her hazel eyes, his expression utterly devoted. "No more oversized coats," Nico commanded, softly pressing a hot, reverent kiss to her full lips. "No more hiding in dusty back rooms. You are the Queen of Boston. You are my anchor, and I will spend eternity worshipping every single soft, beautiful inch of you." He scooped her up into his arms. Despite her weight, he carried her effortlessly, completely unfazed. Stella rested her head against his warm chest, her heavy thighs draping securely over his thick forearm. For the first time in her life, she didn't care about the space she occupied. As Nico carried her out of the ruined library and into the sunlit hallway of the brownstone, Stella finally let out a long, shuddering breath. She was safe, she was seen, and she was absolutely, undeniably worshipped. The battle is won, but Stella and Nico's eternal journey has just begun. If you loved watching Stella step into her power and finally embrace her beautiful soft body, while her vampire king destroyed his enemies, hit that like button. Who wouldn't want a protective, fiercely devoted MMC like Nico Caldwell? Share this story with your friends who obsess over paranormal romance and daylight walking twists. Make sure to subscribe to the channel and drop a comment below. Would you have the courage to bind your soul to the King of Boston? Let us know and stay tuned for more dramatic stories.